Well, Australian researchers have made a breakthrough in our understanding of mental illness. Depression and anxiety are the two most prevalent psychiatric disorders in the world and often occur together. Now, for the first time, a genetic link has been identified. A study led by the QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute has identified more than 500 genes that influence both depression and anxiety. The findings have been published today in the prestigious journal Human Nature Behaviour. Professor Eske Derks is the lead researcher. Professor, welcome to RN Breakfast.
Thank you. Good morning.
What is the most significant finding of this research?
Yeah, so we have done a genetic study looking at the genetic risk factors for depression and anxiety. Very little was known so far about which genes influence anxiety. We knew a bit more about depression. And it was really interesting to see that there was such large sharing of genes between influencing depression and anxiety, which confirms that clinical link that you already mentioned.
And how does that work? How do these genes influence our thinking, our outlook, our behaviour?
Yeah, so it's very complex. As you said, it's many genes, and each of these genes will have a small effect on your biology and on your risk for anxiety and depression by changing biological processes.
In what way?
The risk. Yeah, so it can increase the risk. It can go through many different ways. It can go through changing your brain, certain immune pathways, the metabolism. So it's through many different biological pathways, and in combination with environment, really, because these disorders, they're like between 30 to 40% heritable, so they're also influenced by environment.
So what does that mean for people? If we have these particular genes, does that mean there's not much we can do, or are there ways to manage the chemistry, the biology that's ticking away there?
Yeah, no, not at all. There's a lot you can do, fortunately. And we know that if you have a lot of these risk genes, you are at a higher risk to suffer from depression or anxiety. But as I mentioned before, genes are only part of the story. And also, nothing is set in stone. Even if you do develop depression or anxiety, many people respond really well to treatment.
And will this research help us with some of the medication in particular to know how to lock on to some of what's going on in the brain?
Yeah, so the next step will be for us to look at all these genes that we have found now and see if there's any existing medications that target how active these genes are. So if you have any medications that may change how these genes are active throughout the lifespan, you can potentially modify that risk and decrease it. So that's one of our next studies that we will be conducting.
Professor, will there be any need for genetic testing? Will people be able to get a test to understand what their genetics are and what kind of role that might be playing in any issues with depression and anxiety?
Yeah, I think we're not there yet, so we can't do any individual prediction at the moment. But I think in maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I think genetics will be one of the factors that clinicians will be looking at. It's very likely that the GP will have access to your genetic profile and can look at how high your risk is for anxiety and depression, but it will only be one of the components. I mean, other factors are lifestyle, family history, and other things.
Does that mean that these genetics can be modified?
We can't modify the genetic makeup, like your DNA profile that you will have. That's not something that you will modify. But sometimes you can, even if you know that someone is at a high genetic risk, you could do prevention, like not necessarily changing the genes, but just making sure that the lifestyle doesn't increase the risk for depression. So if you know who's at risk, it would really help.
How does this work also dovetail into looking at issues such as Alzheimer's? Will this further some of the research in Alzheimer's as well?
Yeah, so I'm also studying the genetics of Alzheimer's, and we've done some work already on finding new treatments for Alzheimer's disease. based on the genetic data. And that's just very interesting results. Like some of the drugs that are already being used for Alzheimer's were one of the most highly ranked genes in our analysis, or highly ranked drugs in our analysis, but there were also novel drugs that could be used maybe.
And what interests you most about that? What's the most exciting part of that, do you think?
Well, if you can find new ways to treat people. I mean, for anxiety and depression, many people respond to treatment, and that's really good, but some don't respond to treatment. So if we can find new medications to help these people who do not recover from their anxiety or depression, that would be amazing. Like, that would be a dream for me in my research, if I can help contribute to that.
Professor, there remains still a great deal of stigma around mental illness. With this growing body of research showing that genetics are maybe part of the issue, do you think that may help to overcome some of that stigma when people understand that in some aspects it's hereditary like many other diseases?
Yeah, I really hope so. We've learned so much about genetics, about many different diseases like mental health, but also diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And what we've learned is that these diseases are so similar in to the extent that they are influenced by genes. So I really hope that people start to realize that mental health disorders are not very different from having diabetes, and that it will help people to look at this in a different way. Like, if you have depression or anxiety, it's not a matter of being weak, or you don't have to feel ashamed. It's really just something that's also just in your brain, and something that can be treated. So I would really encourage people who have these, like, are suffering from these disorders, to seek treatment, because some people don't seek treatment just because they feel because of the stigma in the society.
Stigma is certainly huge and damaging. Professor, thank you very much for joining us on RN Breakfast.
Thank you as well.
That's Professor Eske Derks, who's a senior researcher from the QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute in Brisbane. She's leading this groundbreaking study that's identified the genetic tie between depression and anxiety for the first time.